Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. I am super excited for today's video because we're going to be discussing my annual palette usage. So most used palettes all the way to my least used palettes. I have been tracking my palette usage, I think since 2020 now. So my annual palette usage, I track every single time I reach for an eyeshadow palette, whether that be for one shade, multiple shades, and I'm here to share the data with you guys today. So if you're interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Alright guys, I tried to dig back through my spreadsheets. I probably could have gone and watched the videos, so shame on me for being lazy, but I wanted to compare 2023 to the previous years, and I can only find 2022's information. So we're going to compare this year to last year, and I'm actually going to start by giving you kind of the statistics, the percentages, etc., and then I will share with you my least used and most used palettes. I typically do all of my unused palettes of the year, but I recently did an unused palette bingo where I shared with you my current unused palettes in my collection, so I'll leave that video linked down below. Since then, I have purchased a few palettes that are currently unused, and I counted those in my totals here just so that I can give accurate information with the total number of palettes, which after decluttering, I have 154 palettes currently in my makeup collection. That's including all of the new palettes to my collection, also including one palette that has not yet arrived to me. As of right now, I have 20 unused eyeshadow palettes in my collection. One of those hasn't even arrived to me, but I wanted to get it in my spreadsheet. So either 20 palettes that have been unused for the last year, or some of those are brand new to my collection that I have not yet gotten around to using. So 20 out of 154 accounts for 13% of my makeup collection. Last year at this time, I had 155 palettes. So actually my palette collection went down by one due to decluttering and stuff this year. 30 of my eyeshadow palettes last year were unused at the end of the year, which accounted for 19% of my palette collection. So we definitely have made improvements in the amount of unused eyeshadow palettes in my collection, which makes me so happy. But I've broken up the number of uses into 7 categories. I have 1 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, and 30 plus. And it looks like last year I did it similar but not quite the same. So I'm gonna give you the most accurate information I can based on these numbers. So in the 1 to 4 category this year, I have 84 eyeshadow palettes that I've used anywhere from 1 to 4 times, and that accounts for 54.5% of my palette collection. I can scoot over so I can post the data right here. In 2022, I had 79 eyeshadow palettes that fell into this category, so 51%, which is kind of interesting to me because that's just a little bit surprising to me. Actually, no, it's not, because, well, yes, it is, because more palettes fell into my 1 to 4. I'm a little bit surprised by that. We're just gonna keep going because I'm confused. I did also just want to point out 28 of those 84 eyeshadow palettes were palettes that just got used 1 total time in my collection, just as a side note, and that's about 18.2% of my palette collection. In the 5 to 9 category, this is where I feel like we made significant improvements, and this makes me really happy. I had 38 eyeshadow palettes this year that fell into the 5 to 9 category, so that accounts for 24.7% of my palette collection. In 2022, I had 29 eyeshadow palettes fall into this category, which was 19% of my palette collection. So I definitely went up in terms of the amount of eyeshadow palettes that I was using 5 or more times, which makes me happy that I'm not just reaching for, you know, my palette collection, like each palette in my collection just 1 time. I don't know if that makes sense at all. Like, are we tracking what my mind is saying? I don't know. In the 10, so this is where it gets a little interesting. So I broke it up 10 to 14 this year and then 15 to 19, whereas in 2022, I just had 10 to 19 as a category, all encompassing. So this year, I had 8 eyeshadow palettes that I reached for 10 to 14 times, which is about 5.2% of my palette collection. And in the 15 to 19 category, I had 2 eyeshadow palettes fall into that category, which is 1.3% of my palette collection. In 2022, I had 13 palettes that I reached for 10 to 19 times, which is 8%. And so that's interesting. So I actually had 3 more eyeshadow palettes in the 10 to 19 last year than I did this year. I do feel like I brought in more eyeshadow palettes that I was testing this year, and I feel like the palettes that I was testing this year, I reached for quite a bit, but anywhere between 5 and 10 times. But also just kind of interesting. It's interesting to reflect on the data. In 2023, so this past year, I had 0 eyeshadow palettes fall into the 20 to 24, as well as 0 eyeshadow palettes that fall into the 25 to 29 category. In 2022, I had 3 eyeshadow palettes fall into that category. And then finally, in 2023, I had 2 eyeshadow palettes fall into the 30 plus category, which is 1.3% of my palette collection. And in 2022, I had 1 eyeshadow palette fall into this category. So that is quickly just the data of it all. I have so much fun tracking the data. Like, it's embarrassing how much fun I have doing that. Because it would take me forever in a day to go through 154 eyeshadow palettes, I'm not going to go through the palettes in the 1 to 4 category, those 84 eyeshadow palettes. I will leave a link in case you guys are interested. I will leave a link for my spreadsheet in the description box down below, so you can kind of go look through my spreadsheet and see which palettes got what use. Okay, I have my stacks in front of me for 5 to 9, and we're gonna start with 5 and we'll work our way up to our most used palette. By the way, my most used palette of the year was my Pan That palette, which is the ABH Sultry, but I'm not talking about this palette. This is something that I need to finish editing my Pan That palette video today, and then this palette is even dirtier than I left it. I feel like my daughter was playing around in this even more. But this is getting thrown away because it's so dirty, so messy. I reached this 205 times this year. And that is the most that I will probably ever reach for a palette in a year, because I'm never doing Pan That palette again. Anyway, let's start with the 5 use stack. I believe I have 13 stacks in 13 palettes in this stack. So first up, I have my Too Faced Italian Spritz palette. I absolutely loved this palette, and I cannot wait to pull this back out this spring, summer. I had so much fun creating looks with this palette, and I was really impressed with this one. This is probably my favorite Too Faced palette that they've ever released. I have 3 from Odin's Eyes. So I have the Jewels and Gem palette, really, really stunning palette. I also have the Sea Talk palette that they did in collaboration with Lauren from Lauren May Beauty. I already cannot wait to play with this palette some more this year as well. Last year, because of Pan That palette and because I dabbled a little bit in eyeshadow panning, I'm just excited. This will be my first year in probably 7 or 8 years that I'm not, aside from doing No Pan Left Behind, which is not specifically focused on trying to pan eyeshadow, I really am letting myself just use my palette collection. So I'm really curious to see what the numbers are going to reflect at the end of 2024. But the other Odin's Eye palette that I have in the 5 use category is the Little Ghost palette. I had so much fun with this one as well. Then looking at all these purples, I'm like, the Vikings play again tomorrow, probably for the last time this season. I also could have used this palette for my Vikings look when I took my daughter to the New Year's Eve game that we played so bad in. But another 5 use stack. I have both of my palettes from Nomad Cosmetics that I purchased this year. So we have the Ghost Town palette, really beautiful palette. Also very excited to continue to play with that. And then I have the Okavango Safari palette. I will be curious too, like pending how many palettes I bring in, I'll be so curious to see how I use my palette collection this year. We have the Natasha Denona Yucca palette, which I feel like I've reached for more than 5 times. Some of this, like there could be, you know, some missing tallies just because user error. I mean, I'm bound to make a mistake at least once during 365 days, but this is such a beautiful palette. One of my favorite palettes of 2023. Then I have the Natasha Denona Pastel palette as well. This one was definitely not a favorite tippity top palette from Natasha Denona for me. I have the Moira Fun is in the Air palette. This is my first time trying Moira Cosmetics. Definitely not my favorite formula, but as we know, I really do love some of the bright neons in this palette. So I know I'll get some more use out of this one this year. Then I have the Glamlight Scooby-Doo 2 palette, which I also reached for 5 times. This one, I haven't even used every single shade within this palette. There are some shades in here that I really like for nail polish, using eyeshadow nail polish, and I'm already looking in and I'm like, yep, I'm seeing some nail polish looks that I want to do. Then I have the Dose of Colors Friendcation palette, which I reached for 5 total times this year. I feel like I reached for this one way more than 5 times, but alas, 5 is all that I tracked. I have the ColourPop Lemoncello palette. Makes me so sad I only reached for this one 5 times because this is a favorite eyeshadow palette in my collection. And that's why I also like to track my palette usage. In my mind, I'm like, oh, these are like favorite palettes. But then I look and I'm like, well, why aren't you reaching for them? And then I also have the Pat McGrath Moonlit Seduction palette, which is such a mouth-wateringly beautiful eyeshadow palette as well. So those were all the palettes that I reached for 5 times. Moving on to my 6-use stack, we have the Viseart Soleil Le Plage palette, one of my favorite palettes, especially just for like everyday neutrals. I'm already so excited to reach into some of these yellows. I want to do like a number of yellow looks this year. Then I have both my Natasha Denona Mini Love and Mini Nude. Mini Nude is like an all-time favorite palette, so I'm kind of surprised I only reached for that 6 total times. I have the Utopian palette from Pat McGrath, which I reached for 6 times, and hoping to get more use in general out of my Pat McGrath palette collection this year, just because they're so expensive. They're such pricey palettes. I'd like to be reaching for them on a more significant basis. I also have the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette, which I reached for 6 times, and already this year I've reached for this almost 6 times. Now that I don't have my ABH Sultry palette to be focused on, this is like my everyday, more cool toned eyeshadow palette, and I have been reaching for this one so frequently. I also have my Lethal Cosmetics Wildflower palette, reached for 6 total times. Really, really beautiful palette. This is a palette that I'm focused on in January this year, and I'm so excited to continue to reach into that. I also have from It's Belle Cosmetics the Flare palette. This is an all shimmer palette. Really beautiful. I've really enjoyed these shimmers, and it definitely makes me interested to try more from this brand as well. I don't know if they do just all shimmer palettes, which isn't like my least favorite thing ever, but like sometimes it's nice to have like a matte or 2. From Glaminatrix, I have their Nearly Nocturnal, or not Nearly Nocturnal, just the Nocturnal palette. This is such a beautiful, fun, grungy color story. I definitely love the special shades in here more than like the mattes, although I do really like the selection of mattes. I feel like it's just a really fun color story, and I'm excited to reach for that one, especially next spooky season again. I feel like I was so focused on using the Trick or Treat and Little Ghost palette this year that like I didn't reach for this one as much as I could have this past spooky season. The ColourPop The Muppets palette. I absolutely loved this palette, so I need to pull this one back out and get more use out of this, because I feel like I reached for this 6 times at the beginning of the year and then like was already on to other things and focused on like continuing to use the rest of my collection. But I love this palette, and I feel like there's so much variety in terms of colors and just the direction you can go with this palette. This one needs to get pulled out again very soon. And then I also, the last palette that I reached for 6 total times was my Adept Cosmetics Plain Jane Remastered palette. Again, an all shimmer palette. I love the Adept formula. I feel like they make some really unique, very special shades. And I would like to reach for my Adept palette collection even more this year as well. I feel like there's definitely opportunity to get more use out of my Adept collection. Even if I'm just doing like an everyday neutral look with like my I Need a Nude palette, using this to just spice up the look, we can get more use out of the Adept collection. Moving on to my 7-use stack, I have the What's Up Beauty Desert Monsoon palette, a really, really beautiful eyeshadow palette. I personally really love the What's Up Beauty eyeshadow formula. I think they make a really, really solid formula. I love their shimmer shades. They're so intense, metallic, and foiled on the eyes. And I loved the shade Downpour as a blue nail polish this year as well. Then I have the Odin's Eye Norns palette right here. I actually forgot that I had hit pan on the shade Pink Chameleon this year. I was kind of surprised to see that I reached for this 7 times. This is a palette that I'm currently focused on this in my No Pan Left Behind, as well as it's a January Focus palette. It's a palette that I feel like, I don't know if I love it like I used to, and I have so many other palettes from Oden's Eye now. It's like, do I need to keep this at the end of the year? We'll see. Favorite palette in my collection, NARS Summer Solstice. I reached for this palette 7 total times, and I'm hoping to reach for this one even more this year. I love the lid topper shades in this palette. I think that they are absolutely stunning. Yes, I did just pick up the new NARS palette because, let me grab this. Okay, I've been telling you guys how much I love a checkered print anything, thinking of like the Vans checkered print shoes. There's checkered print on this palette. So it's like NARS like heard me say that and then like produced this palette specifically for me. Just kidding, of course. But they also have 4 of the lid topper formula, like 4 of the lid topper shades that I just absolutely loved from this palette, that same like formula. I cannot wait to play with this palette. I think this might be one of my new favorite everyday go-to neutral palettes. I wish there was like one lighter like shade similar to like this. Like I wish this shade was in this palette, and then it might be like the absolute most perfect palette ever, but I'm so excited about this palette. So not that I've even reached for this once yet, but had to shout it out. Okay, also reached for 7 times. We have the Natasha Denona Gold palette. This I need to reach for more than 7 times because it's an all-time favorite palette in my collection, like truly an all-time favorite. And it's a crying shame that I only reached for this 7 times. So we need to reach for that one more. I have the Natasha Denona Viva palette, which I also reached for 7 times and really fell back in love with this palette this year. So I'm excited to get some more use out of this palette this year as well. I pulled this into a project towards the end of last year, and that is really like when I realized like I'm sleeping on this palette. Like the mattes in here are just so easy to work with and so good. This needs to get more use. Then I have the ABH Cosmos palette, which was a new palette to my collection last year, and I really enjoyed reaching into this palette. I created some looks with this palette that I absolutely loved. If you missed my 100 looks with 100 palettes, I'll leave that link down below, and you can see there's a couple of different looks that I created using this palette that I just absolutely loved. And then the last palette is actually a face palette, but this I really purchased to use as eyeshadow. It's the Bella Beauté Bar Oracle palette, and there's just 6 shades in here, but I love these shades for inner corner highlights. I have one on the inner corner today. I have the High Priestess, and this is gonna get a ton of use in its lifetime with me. Moving on to my 8 use stack, I have 4 here. I have from What's Up Beauty, I have the Geodes palette, which was also a palette that got a ton of use out of me in 2022. I hit a pan on the shade Citrine this year. It's one of my favorite yellows in my collection for the inner corner. I also really love the shade Peridot in here, and Earthlike I feel like should get some more love for me because I'm always talking about how much I love a blue brown shade, but then like I always forget there's this really beautiful blue brown in this palette. So hoping this one maintains its use into 2024 and again has another year of high use with me. Not that 8 is like, for as large of a palette collection as I have, I feel like 8's decent, but anyway. Next up I have the Huda Beauty Mercury Retrograde palette, which I reached for 8 total times. This palette I would like to reach for like at least 10 times this year because I always talk about how much I love this palette, but it's definitely getting older in my collection, so we need to be reaching for her a little bit more. Then I have my Glaminatrix Sugar and Spice palette, and you guys, I wasn't a huge fan of the matte color story in this, but the pans in here are magnetic and the pan sizes are the same as the like smaller pan sizes of ColourPop palettes. So I actually swapped out a few of my shades with a couple of ColourPop matte shades because I wanted a little bit of warmth in here. So mine looks a little bit different, but just a shout out if you have this palette and you wanted to do something similar. I feel like I like the palette so much more now that I popped in a couple of warm shades, and then I just have the cooler tone shades sitting in one of my Z palettes. But I fell in love with Glaminatrix as a brand this year, and I'm so excited for just everything that they hopefully will be releasing this year. They have such a nice, especially their metallics are so punchy and so metallic. They're like molten glitter on the eyes. They're so beautiful, but they are like the smoothest, silkiest, soft texture. It's incredible, and they make some really, really intense, beautiful multi-chrome and duochrome shadows as well. So really love Glaminatrix. And then also the Fantasy Cosmetica Druid palette, I also reached for 8 total times. This is another really beautiful palette, and I'm definitely interested in purchasing more Fantasy Cosmetica palettes this year. I've been trying to hold off, but I love the 2 duochrome shades in here. I think they're so beautiful, and I reached for this 8 times. My camera battery is flashing at me, but I'm wondering if we can get through my 4 9-use palettes before it dies. So from LH Cosmetics, I have the Shimmer Saga Quad. I think this is a really beautiful quad, just to add like a metallic shimmer or some sparkle to the eye, especially if there's like a look I'm feeling is just a little bit dull. I'll pop one of these shades on. So this is a really handy quad to have in my collection. I'm really glad that I purchased that. Huda Beauty Rose Quartz, I believe, is my new favorite Huda Beauty like large palette. It's so beautiful and just so different than a lot of the other like Huda palettes, or even just like other eyeshadows I have. I love the metallic shades, or just like, I know that Huda has so many different textures and tones throughout her palettes and finishes. I love the variety in this palette. The Moon Magic Blissful shade, even Energized. There's just some really beautiful ethereal shades in here that I love. So I reached for that 9 total times, and honestly could have reached for it even more than 9. I had so much fun creating looks with this palette when it was going in my No Pan Left Behind series. The ABH Jackie palette, I reached for 9 total times. I'm hoping that this gets at least like 20 uses in my collection this year, because I have raved about this being a favorite palette in my collection for so long, and I feel like sometimes I just don't reach into it because it is limited edition, and I know I can't get it anymore. I love like the shade Zam, Soleil, Edge's Credit, Ginger Sponsored, Lituation, some of my favorites, and I just need to use them. Otherwise, I fear the formula will start to go bad. So we gotta get some more use out of that. And then I always rave about the Danessa Myricks palette, so I'm excited to see all 3 of my Danessa Myricks palettes. Like, this is the lowest used Danessa Myricks palette, and I reached for this 9 total times. This is the Lightwork Volume 4. Really, really beautiful, unique palette. I don't know what else to say. I really, really love the Danessa Myricks palettes. I even had fun with some of these. I know these 4 shades aren't for everyone. There's some that are like water activated. There's some that are like more of like a chunky, like editorial, like really chunky texture that, like, again, not for everyone, but I had so much fun with those ones as well. I actually hit a pan. I forgot. This is my last pan of 2023. I hit a pan on the shade Divinity on New Year's Eve when I was creating my look for the Vikings game. So I do have a pan in this palette, as well as I hit a pan on Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3 this year. So I love these palettes, and I reached for this one 9 total times. I'm gonna swap out my stacks, and then I am also gonna swap out my camera battery, and we'll be right back to share with you my 10 through 14 palette. Hey guys, I'm back to talk about the 8 palettes that fell into the 10 to 14 category. So starting with my stack of palettes that I reached for 10 total times. First up, I have the Alien Cosmetics Not Normal palette, and I mostly reached into this palette for this shade right here. I do need to create some look, like I need to No Pan Left Behind this palette this year. It is one of my palettes with like my favorite packaging ever, so I don't see myself ever getting rid of this palette, but I definitely like feel extremely intimidated by the color story of this. So that's why I find myself not reaching for that one that much. I reached for the the Odin's Eye Trick or Treat palette 10 total times, and I just had so much fun with this collection as a whole. I just like looking into this palette, it just like makes me happy. I think it's such a fun color story. I love everything about this color story, and it's crazy because when I first saw the palettes launch, I was like, ooh, I don't think those color stories are for me. I'm not exactly sure what I'm gonna do with them, but I felt so creatively inspired reaching into this collection. And it's crazy because my Odin's Eye Hella palette was my most reached for palette, I believe, of 2022, and her second collection with Odin's Eye I just loved so much this year as well. From Glaminatrix, probably my newest favorite eyeshadow palette in my collection is the Nearly Natural palette from Glaminatrix. Metallic shades, so punchy, metallic, glittery on the eyes, just truly so beautiful. But then the mattes are definitely more buildable, which I feel like makes the palette a bit more approachable. I just fell in love with this palette this year, and I'm so glad to have that. And then the Danessa Lightwork Volume 5 palette released this year, and I reached for this 10 total times, and just so excited to continue to reach into this palette. I think it's so fun, interesting, unique, beautiful. I love this palette so much as well. Again, I cannot rave enough about the Danessa Lightworks palettes if you're looking for something truly unique to add to a palette collection. Again, it's an all shimmer palette, so take that or leave it, but I love the Danessa palettes. And then speaking of, moving on to my stack of the 11 uses, I have the Danessa Lightwork Volume 3. This is my most used Danessa palette of this year. I did end up hitting a pan on the shade Polaris, and I just absolutely love this palette so much. I like cannot shut up about this palette and haven't been able to since purchasing this, so love that one. And then both of my Rowan quads, I reached for each of these 11 times each. So I have the 1111 quad, which I actually ended up repurchasing because my previous one got destroyed by my daughter, and I love this palette so much I had to go purchase it again. So I've reached for it 11 total times. Love everything about the Rowan quads. If you don't like a cream shadow, this is not going to be for you. I don't believe this palette is going to be for everyone, but I personally love it with my whole heart. 1111 is my favorite. And then the 75 Degrees quad is the one that I've owned the longest, and I'm actually trying to see how many of these shadows how much I can reach for this palette and how much of these shadows I can use up. And actually I think, no, maybe that's just a nail mark. I thought maybe I saw a pan on this shade right here, which is definitely my most used shade in this palette. But I reached for this 11 total times last year, and I'm gonna see how many times I can reach for this year and how much of this palette I can use up. Obviously, I swear there is. I think there might be a pan that's just, maybe not. I thought there was a pan. I'm gonna see how much of this palette I can use up. Because they are cream shadows, they're obviously gonna go bad quicker than a powder shadow, so would like to actually like get my money's worth out of this. And then I have my 12 use stack, which is one palette. It is the Odin's Eye Hella palette. Again, love this palette. I ended up hitting a pan on the shade Double Sided this year. I think this is such a beautiful, fun color story. Another shade I love so much is the shade River. It's such a beautiful duochrome. And then I love all the greens up here. I'm excited to play around with some of these yellows as I'm creating yellow looks this year. Again, I'm feeling very inspired by the color yellow. So we'll see what happens, but I had just a great time continuing to play with the Hella palette this year. All right, for my 15 to 19 stacks, I have two palettes. Both of them I have reached for 15 total times, and these are both just near and dear to my heart, oldies but goodies. So up first, I have the Persona Identity 1 palette, and I'm glad that I reached for this 15 times. I would have liked to have reached for it more, but this is a palette that I have raved about for years on my channel. I have the old packaging. I have spoken so highly of this palette, but I feel like this is one of those palettes I felt like I can only wear on special occasions, which is just so silly. So I'm hoping by the end of this coming year, I'll have pan. I'm definitely on the shade Humble. I think will be no problem, the lid setting shade, but I would like to see maybe even like one of the shimmer shades have pan. I would like to have reach for this palette, you know, at least maybe 20 to 30 times minimum. But now that I have, you know, now that I've done my Pan That palette with ABH Sultry, I feel like this can help to fill the void that maybe I won't have anymore with ABH Sultry. I mean, I feel like I'm so over ABH Sultry, at least right now. I'm like, is there even a void to fill? But just something like that has a little bit more like cool tones to it. I love the shimmers in here. They're very smooth on the eyelids while still being extremely metallic. I recently did a look with this palette that I loved so much. So I reached for this one 15 times. And then the Tartelette In Bloom palette, another palette I have repurchased because I had to declutter my other one. It was so old. And then I really did miss having this in my palette collection. It is not the most special palette by any means, but this is just a tried and true trusty palette. If I just want to not have to think about what I'm doing with my makeup, but want my makeup to like come out looking like I somewhat know how to do my makeup, I take this traveling with me, whether it be to my mom's house for the weekend, whether it be out of town for a couple of days, whether it be to Las Vegas. I brought this with me. I'm going to Vegas again this spring. This will come with me anytime I'm traveling. This comes with, because I'm just like, I know like I've got enough to like make myself feel confident in this palette. So reach for that 15 total times, which brings us to my two most used palettes of the year. One of them I reached for 30 times, one I reached for 32 times. Both of these were palettes I was working on in my project Level Up. I did not continue on in that project because I just feel like I don't care to pan eyeshadows, at least in this current moment. Like, do I get excited if I hit pan on an eyeshadow? Yes. But I would like to enjoy my palette collection in a different way rather than hyper focusing on a couple palettes here and there to hit pan. So I'm just kind of like shifting my mindset there. I love eyeshadow so much and I love to test and try new things. I've been really having fun testing indie eyeshadows. But I found that I felt like so much of my palette collection was getting neglected when I was trying to pan eyeshadow. So I've decided we're doing no pan left behind, and that's the only eyeshadow project that I'm really doing. Yes, I am working on my 75 degrees quad and my rolling project 10 pan, but I'm not trying to put too much pressure on myself. And because it's such a neutral palette, I really can use that palette so much with so many other palettes. Like, it can kind of be a complementary palette to so many other palettes that I don't feel like it's going to take away from me testing and trying and playing with my palette collection. That being said, the Escape Pod from Kaleidos. I reached for this palette 30 total times and hit pan on 3 separate shades in this palette. And I'm really glad that I did get to kind of hyper focus on this palette because it's a palette I would not naturally reach for 30 times in any given year. But I really fell in love with this palette this year. I love this shade Soiree, this really beautiful kind of periwinkle shade, periwinkly lavender neon. I don't know, I love that shade, especially on the lower lash line with like a warm brown on like my main eye. I love that look. The shade Starlight Sonata is such a beautiful inner corner highlight. There's so much fun to be had in this eyeshadow palette, and I'm really glad that I was able to get so much use out of it this year. And then my most used, most reached for palette of 2023 is this one from NARS. And we know I love NARS so much, but this was in my project Level Up, and I actually only hit a pan on here because I dropped this palette and it cracked. The pans in the NARS eyeshadows are so deep. Like, you are getting some bang for your buck with these NARS palettes, but this is the the Orgasm Rising palette, and I reached for this 32 total times. NARS just makes a really good eyeshadow formula in my opinion. They have a really good matte. I've struggled with the NARS Climax mattes, but aside from that, I've always had good luck with NARS mattes. And then I just love their formula that's more of like a lid topper. It's still so sparkly on the eyes, so smooth and so beautiful. I love it so much. So I did reach for this palette 32 times in 2023. But after that, you guys, that is my list of least used and most used eyeshadow palettes in my collection. Again, I will have my spreadsheet linked below in case you're interested in seeing how many times I used each palette in my collection, as well as a full breakdown of every eyeshadow palette that I currently have in my collection. Some of them I typed so fast, you're probably like, what do you mean by this? But anyway, it'll be linked down below. I would love to know, what was your least reached for and most reached for palette last year? Let a girl know in the comments below. Other than that, thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.